Hi everyone, welcome again. We're continuing on with the Armstrong reading, which is from his book, The Nature of Mind. So far we've had Armstrong explain to us why he thinks that science is the best, source of knowledge. And remember, this is because science reaches consensus of learned individuals. No other field achieves this. Now, keep in mind, this is what we call an argument to best explanation. Does this prove that science is always right? No, it doesn't. But what Armstrong is saying, and he admits that, but what Armstrong is saying is, well, if we're looking for an answer to a question, and we've got lots of different fields, why don't we go with the field that answers questions best? It might not give us the right answer this time, but it's the best place to start looking for the answer. Why would we start with religion or philosophy or literature when we could start with science? And so this is why he supports the materialist view. And really, then his mission becomes, well, now we've just got to figure out a description of human nature, which includes all of the mental phenomena, that includes the attributes of the mind as being able to be explained in a purely physical way. So that's sort of the mission that he's entered into now. We've heard about behaviorism, which at its core is just the argument that our mental states are just behavior, that's it. This works fine for the third person account in terms of, well, all I ever see from you or anyone that I'm looking at is their behavior. So I never know what you're thinking. I never know what your mental state is until I see a behavior that tells me. So I don't know that you're sad until you cry. That kind of idea. But it doesn't really fit with our first person account. And you should be sitting there going, yeah, but there are times where I can be upset and not show it. Exactly. And so the behaviorist account doesn't really fit. We get an adjustment to the behaviorist account with Riley behaviorism. And this is when we get the glass analogy, that our mind and the mental phenomena are a bit like brittleness in glass. Brittleness could be best explained as breakage waiting to happen. So once the correct circumstances are met, then the glass will break. Why? Because it has this, element of brittleness in it. Again, this, seems to fit, but we all know that our mind is much more powerful than that, and our mental states are much more powerful than that. They're not just behavior waiting to happen. That's not our experience of consciousness. What they are is they can quite often be a cause of behavior. I'm sure that we can all think of times where we've literally thought ourselves into certain behavior. And so this is the issue that Armstrong has with Riley behaviorism, that thoughts are more powerful than just merely being a behavior waiting to happen. Instead, they are, what Armstrong is going to say in this next section is they are a cause for behavior. So let's get our readers out. And so we're going from the left-hand side of the page. You should see page number 7. We're going one paragraph down. So the first line I'm going to read is, but perhaps we need not grieve too deeply. So highlighters at the ready, and let's kick it off. So, but perhaps we need not grieve too deeply about the failure of behaviorism to produce a satisfactory theory of mind. Behaviorism is a profoundly unnatural account of mental processes. If somebody speaks and acts in certain ways, it is natural to speak of this speech and action as the expression of his thought. It is not at all natural to speak of his speech and action as identical with his thought. So here he's pointing out a problem with traditional behaviorism and Riley behaviorism for that matter. When we say that someone's speaking, we don't say that that is that person's thought. We say it's an expression of what they were thinking. So the thought exists separate to the behavior. It is not at all natural to speak of his speech and action as identical with his thought. We naturally think of the thought as something quite distinct from the speech, and action that, under suitable circumstances, brings the speech and action about. Thoughts are not to be identified with behavior, we think. They lie behind behavior. A man's behavior constitutes the reason we have for attributing certain mental processes to him, but the behavior cannot be identified with the mental processes. So this idea of thought being behind behavior, as kind of like, sort of the man behind the curtain, to use the Wizard of Oz analogy, this is more like how we experience our mind. There is something there that's causing us to behave in a certain way. It's not just the behavior, it's not the same thing, it is something else. So this suggests a very interesting line of thought about the mind. Behaviorism is certainly wrong. So there you go. I mean, that's a nice little part to highlight there. Armstrong is in no way saying that behaviorism is correct, that the idea that our mental phenomena are just just behaviors waiting to happen. But perhaps it is not altogether wrong. Perhaps the behaviorists are wrong in identifying the mind and mental occurrences with behavior, but perhaps they are right in thinking that our notion of a mind and of individual mental states is logically tied to behavior. For perhaps what we mean by a mental state is some state of the person that, under suitable circumstances, brings about a certain range of behavior. Now that, he's italicized it for you, but brings about is a really important thing. This implies cause. Okay, so our mind or our mental state brings about a certain range of behavior. It is not the same as the behavior, but it is a cause for the behavior. So they are linked. Perhaps mind can be defined not as behavior, but rather as the inner cause of certain behavior. Thought is not speech under suitable circumstances. Rather, it is something within the person that, in suitable circumstances, brings about speech. And, in fact, I believe that this is the true account, or at any rate, a true first account of what we mean by a mental state. How does this line of thought link up with a purely physicalist view of man? Sorry, just to pause for a moment at the end of that paragraph. Here we've got Armstrong saying, well, this is what he thinks the mind is. This is what he thinks is the correct definition of the mind. This idea of an inner cause, the man behind the curtain. Continuing on. How does this line of thought link up with a purely physicalist view of man? The position is that while it does not make such a physicalist view inevitable, it does make it possible. So remember, please, and the last dot point on the slide here, Armstrong is not trying to disprove dualism. What he's trying to show is we can explain the nature of mankind without the need of a non-physical soul or mind. Obviously, this is a much simpler explanation than muddying the waters by saying that no, we exist as a physical body and a non-physical mind. It brings up all sorts of questions. Where does the mind come from? How does it attach? How does the mind interact with the body? All of these issues pop up when we flirt with the dualist argument. The physicalist argument doesn't have that problem. So all he's trying to show is that a purely physical view of mankind is possible. He's not proving that it is the case, but it is possible. That's all he wants. If it is possible, the next conclusion that you should come to is that, well, we should side with the simpler of the two answers. It doesn't guarantee us, but remember, this is an argument to best explanation. So it does not entail, but is compatible with a purely physicalist view of man. If our notion of the mind and of mental states is nothing but that of a cause within the person of certain ranges of behavior, then it becomes a scientific question and not a question of logical analysis. What in fact the intrinsic nature of that cause is? The cause might be, as Descartes thought it was, a spiritual substance working through the pineal gland to produce the complex bodily behavior of which men are capable. Okay, so he's saying it could be dualism, what we take to be the mind. It might be breath, or specifically smooth and mobile atoms dispersed throughout the body. It might be many other things, but in fact the verdict of modern science seems to be that the sole cause of mind betokening behavior in man and the higher animals is the physico-chemical workings of the central nervous system. So, could it be Descartes' version of mind? Absolutely. Could it be the religious idea of a soul, or Plato's idea of the soul or psyche? Maybe. It could be. Could it just be a different form of matter, like particularly smooth and mobile atoms, that we're not yet aware of? It could be. Could it be the workings of our central nervous system, which we do know about, and we do see a strong link between that and mental phenomenon? Yeah, it certainly could. Isn't that the simpler answer then? Like, shouldn't we take this to be the correct answer for now, at least, until we have more evidence? Why should we side with dualism when it's a more complex answer with no more evidence, is what Armstrong is really saying here. And so, assuming we have correctly categorized our concept of a mental state as nothing but the cause of certain sorts of behavior, then we can identify these mental states with purely physical states of the central nervous system. So, the mental states are just the workings of the central nervous system. It is the physico-chemical workings of the central nervous system. What is your mind? It is the firing of neurons and the release of neurotransmitters and the interplay between these two. That's it. That's what your mind is. So this is presenting a purely physicalist view of man. At this point, we may stop and go back to the behaviorist's disposition. So this idea that the mind is just dispositions to behave in a certain way. We saw that, according to him, the brittleness of glass, or, to take another example, the elasticity of rubber, is not a state of the glass or the rubber, but is simply the fact that things of that sort behave in the way they do. But now let us consider how a scientist would think about brittleness or elasticity. So remember, the behaviorist sort of said, well, brittleness is actually just breakage waiting to happen. Okay? But that's not what a scientist would say. And so Armstrong is going to now say, well, what would a scientist say about the brittleness of glass? What would they say it is? So faced with the phenomenon of breakage under relatively small impacts, or the phenomenon of stretching when a force is applied followed by contraction when the force is removed, he will assume that there is some current state of the glass or the rubber that is responsible for the characteristic behavior of samples of these two materials. At the beginning, he will not know what this state is, but he will endeavour to find out, and he may succeed in finding out. And when he has found out, he will very likely make remarks of this sort. We have discovered that the brittleness of glass is in fact a certain sort of pattern in the molecules of glass. That is to say, he will identify brittleness with the state of the glass that is responsible for the liability of the glass to break. So, what Armstrong is pointing out here is the scientist wouldn't be happy with the explanation of brittleness as just being breakage waiting to happen. This is not a satisfactory answer for the scientist. What the scientist would do is study the glass. And for a long time, they might not ever be able to figure out why glass breaks but rubber doesn't when slight pressure is applied. But they'll keep studying it. They'll keep analyzing it. What will eventually happen is they'll figure out, and this is why glass is brittle, that glass has a particular molecular structure that makes it very inflexible. Because it's very inflexible, if I apply slight amounts of pressure, then the glass is going to break. The molecular bonds are going to break. Okay? And so this is what brittleness is. So the scientist won't just say brittleness is breakage waiting to happen. No, brittleness is this particular molecular structure. That makes it more likely that glass breaks easily. Okay? So for him, a disposition of an object is a state of the object. What makes the state a state of brittleness is the fact that it gives rise to the characteristic manifestation of brittleness. But the disposition itself is distinct from its manifestation. It is the state of the glass that gives rise to these manifestations in suitable circumstances. So the scientist would come to the conclusion that brittleness is not breakage waiting to happen. Brittleness is a state of the glass. It is the molecular structure of the glass. This means that because the glass has that molecular structure, it's more likely to break. Okay, but it's not just breakage waiting to happen. This is an unsatisfactory answer. So this way of looking at dispositions is very different from that of Ryle and the behaviorists. The great difference is this. If we treat dispositions as actual states, as I have suggested that scientists do, even if states the intrinsic nature of which may yet have to be discovered, then we can say that dispositions are actual causes or causal factors, which, in suitable circumstances, actually bring about those happenings that are the manifestations of the dispositions. A certain molecular constitution of glass that constitutes its brittleness is actually responsible for the fact that when the glass is struck, it breaks. So here Armstrong is really laying it out quite clearly in that last sentence that it's wrong to say that brittleness is breakage waiting to happen. Brittleness is much stronger than that. It is actually a cause for the glass to break in the way that it does. So if we think of a ball hitting a window, the ball is one cause for why the glass breaks, but there is another one, the molecular structure of the glass. If that same ball had hit a piece of rubber, it would not break. So there is something causing the action in the glass, okay, and that is the brittleness. Now remember, we're applying this to the idea of the mind and mental phenomenon. This mental phenomenon then is much stronger than just the behavior waiting to happen. Now I cannot argue the matter here because the detail of the argument is technical and difficult, but I believe that the view of dispositions as states, which in the view that is natural to science, is the correct one. Which is the view that is natural to science is the correct one. I believe it can now be shown quite strictly that to the extent that we admit the notion of dispositions at all, we are committed to the view that they are actual states of the object that has the disposition. I may add that I think that the same holds for the closely connected notions of capacities and powers. Here I will simply have to assume this step in my argument. Sorry, I sort of blacked out a little bit there while I was reading, which will be a good example that we can use in the next recording for this automated driver example. So just reading through it again, the notions of dispositions at all, we are committed to the view that they are actual states of the object that has the disposition. I may add that the same holds for the closely connected notions of capacities and powers. So bringing in this idea of capacities and powers is an interesting one. It's kind of like playing the guitar. Okay, some of you listening might be able to play the guitar, others won't be able to play the guitar. The question we have to deal with is, well, why? Why is it that some of you can play the guitar and not? Is it just that you have the behavior? Well, no. You have the mental capability. You have the mental capacity for playing the guitar. Now, this isn't to say that I couldn't learn to play the guitar, but at the moment I can't. I don't have that capacity. Therefore, the behavior is not going to be apparent. Okay, if I try and play the guitar, it will sound terrible. We can think of mental states like this. They are capacities. They are potential behavior. At the moment, I don't have the potential to behavior to play the guitar. If I learn the guitar, then I kind of like get a new capability. It's kind of like upgrading. So now I have the mental condition appropriate for playing the guitar. But perhaps it will be seen that the rejection of the idea that mind is simply a certain range of man's behavior in favor of the view that mind is rather the inner cause of that range of man's behavior is bound up with the rejection of the Rileyan view of dispositions in favor of one that treats dispositions as states of objects, and so as having actual causal power. So this idea of causal power is important. This is really what the mind is for Armstrong. It is a cause for the behavior that we are experiencing. The behaviorists were wrong to identify the mind with behavior. They were not so far off the mark when they tried to deal with cases where mental happenings occur in the absence of behavior by saying that these are dispositions to behave. But in order to reach a correct view, I am suggesting they would have to conceive of these dispositions as actual states of the person who has the disposition. Excuse me. States that have actual causal power to bring about behavior in certain circumstances. But to do this is to abandon the central inspiration of behaviorism, that in talking about the mind, we do not have to go behind outward behavior to inner states. This idea of like the inner states, there is something to it. Arguably, the only reason that you can play the guitar is because, well, your neural structure has changed through practice, and now you have neural pathways that allow you to play the guitar. If we see that as behavior, the changing of your neural pathways, the behaviorists are right all along. There is no difference between mental processes and behavior. But if we're talking about outward behavior, something that I can see in you, well, I can't see neural change in you. Okay, even with scanning technology, this is a very difficult thing to do, and so it's a tricky one to get around. But what Armstrong is saying here is, well, the behaviorists were wrong in saying that the mind is just behavior. It is a cause for the behavior. It's much more powerful than just behavior waiting to happen. And so, two separate but interlocking lines of thought have pushed me in the same direction. The first line of thought is that it goes profoundly against the grain to think of the mind as behavior. This is the original behaviorist view. The mind is rather that which stands behind and brings about our complex behavior. This is the man behind the curtain idea. The second line of thought is that the behaviorist dispositions, properly conceived, are really states that underlie behavior and under suitable circumstances bring about behavior. Putting these two together, we reach the conception of a mental state as, nice definition here, a state of the person apt for producing certain ranges of behavior. So what is a mental state? It is a state of a person apt for producing, so apt is just likely to or able to producing certain ranges of behavior. This formula, a mental state is a state of the person apt for producing certain ranges of behavior, I believe to be a very illuminating way of looking at the concept of a mental state. I have found it fruitful in the search for detailed logical analyses of the individual mental concepts. So if you think about anything that you think about, that's a bit funny, isn't it? Well, let's reword it. If you consider the things that you think about or that you do, you have to ask yourself, is this thought a state of me that's apt for producing a certain range of behavior? Now, most of our thoughts are. In fact, if Armstrong's correct, all of our thoughts are. It doesn't mean that we'll always act out this behavior. Okay, it's not a state that guarantees behavior is performed, but it's apt for producing a certain range of behavior. If you're having a really good day, okay, and you're feeling good about life in general, well, then you're likely to do good things. So, to give a scenario, someone drops their books in the locker bay. If you're having a really good day and you're feeling good about the world, you're likely to help that person and help them to pick up their books. Okay? Now, what Armstrong would say is, well, your mental state was one where you were in a really good mood and you were feeling positive about the world. This is apt for producing the behavior of helping others. It doesn't guarantee that you'll help others. You might just walk away. But you are more likely to help someone in that scenario. If you were angry, you might see them drop their books and think, good, I'm sure they deserved it. I'm having a crap day, why shouldn't they? Okay? So, Armstrong would say exactly the same thing. Well, your mental phenomenon, this is just a state of you that's apt for producing the behavior of not helping, in this case. So, our thoughts do seem to fit with this notion of simply being a state within us apt for producing a certain range of behavior. Last paragraph here for this recording. So, I do not think that Hegel's dialectic had much to tell us about the nature of reality, but I think that human thought often moves in a dialectical way, from thesis to antithesis, and then to the synthesis. Perhaps thought about the mind is a case in point. I have already said that the classical philosophy has tended to think of the mind as an inner area of arena of some sort. We may call this the thesis. So, what did philosophy say about the nature of mind to begin with? Well, it said that it is this inner arena. It's this mystical property, however we want to define that. Okay? The mind, the soul, whatever word we want to use, but it is something else. This is the first explanation we had, and this is the thesis, the original idea. Behaviorism moves in the opposite extreme. The mind is seen as outward behavior. This is the antithesis. So the antithesis goes against the thesis, hence antithesis, antithesis. And this is the behaviorist view. So the thesis is that there's something mystical or magical to us. We'll call this the mind. The behaviorist view is there's nothing magical about you. In fact, all you are is behavior. So it's sort of an overcorrection in the opposite direction. My proposed synthesis, so this is the middle ground between the thesis and the antithesis. My proposed synthesis is that the mind is properly conceived as an inner principle, but a principle that is identified in terms of the outward behavior it is apt for bringing about. This way of looking at the mind and mental states does not itself entail a materialist or physicalist view of man, for nothing is said in this analysis about the intrinsic nature of these mental states. So again, he's going back and stating, could this be Descartes' idea of the thinking thing? Maybe. Could it just be the working of your central nervous system? Also, maybe. Which one of those is simpler? Central nervous system. But if we have, as I have argued that we do have, general scientific grounds for thinking that man is nothing but a physical mechanism, we can go on to argue that the mental states are in fact nothing but physical states of the central nervous system. So this will stop the reading there, and I'll do one last recording for the problem of consciousness, which is the last section. But remember, here Armstrong is actually providing his definition of the mind. That is, it is an inner state apt for producing a certain range of behavior. So it is something that exists in you that is likely to cause a certain field of behavior. Okay, so hopefully that's clear enough. If you've got any questions, bring them to class and we'll sort it out. I hope that, much like Armstrong commented on his own work, I hope this has been illuminating for you. Great word. Yeah, like and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.